With important support from DEEP, I and my collaborators, both within Bangladesh and elsewhere, have continued to focus on understanding the long-term effects of an intervention called the Transfer Modality Research Initiative. TMRI, as it's called, was originally designed and executed as a randomized control trial comparing the effects of providing cash transfers, food transfers, cash transfers twinned with nutrition, behavior, change, communication activities, and food transfers twinned with nutrition, behavior, change, community activities on household consumption, on poverty, and on diets. When TMRI was fielded in 2012 to 2014 as a randomized control trial, we saw that it had important and large effects across a range of welfare measures, period. This is in line with what we see in many similar studies looking at either cash or food transfers. However, within this space, there are important evidence gaps which had not been filled previously. One of these related to just the straight-up comparison between food and cash transfers themselves. There are lots of studies on cash transfers. There are a lot of studies on food transfers, but these are not necessarily directly comparable because they're done in different places, with different transfer amounts, with different frequencies over different time periods, making it very difficult to do a direct head-to-head comparison. The design of TMRI was such that it overcomes that problem. Second, an important part of the TMRI work, and one which the support of DEEP has been incredibly important, is to look at the impacts of this TMRI after it ended. We live in a world now where across the global south, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of interventions, which, when properly executed, have direct and immediate effects on the well-being of the clients that they serve. However, we know far less about the permanence of those effects. In other words, once the program implementers leave, the program ends, what happens to our study participants? Do they go back to the way they were before, or are there any sustained or long-term gains? Third, we don't know a whole lot about whether or not these programs can actually facilitate resilience when shocks occur. And finally, we don't know a whole lot about whether a transfer on its own is sufficient to generate these long-term sustainable effects, or if it needs to be twinned with something else, what we sometimes call cash plus or food plus programming. Our work with DEEP was aimed at actually addressing these important questions. Yeah, so some people might say, why is it that we need yet another study on cash or food transfers? Don't we have enough already? I think, however, the answer is no, and in particular, our work on TMRI has three distinct features. The first is this direct head-to-head comparison of the food and cash transfers. Unlike other studies, in our setup, the cash and the food transfers are of equivalent value. They're given with the same degree of frequency. They're given to the same target populations. They're given for the same duration. All that differs between the two is one is cash, one is food, thus allowing us to make a direct comparison of the effects of both. A second important feature is that we follow these households after the intervention ends. Whether or not interventions have sustainable effects, I would argue, is the acid test of any intervention. And third, because we have both cash transfers and a cash plus component, and because we have a food transfer and a food plus component, we can see to what extent complementary programming, in this case, nutrition, behavior, change, communication activities, improves or amplifies the impact of the cash transfers. So, what is it that we find in this work? We perceive a number of salient and interesting findings. The first is that the food transfers have no long-term sustained effects. To be clear, when the intervention took place, food transfers improved household welfare. But they don't appear to have any long-term effects. Second, we find that the cash transfers have sustainable effects, but those effects are location-specific. We did the TMRI study in both the north and the south of Bangladesh, and we see some evidence of sustained effects of the cash transfers in the north, albeit sometimes somewhat small and imprecisely measured, but not in the south. And then, by contrast, there are the households in the north that received both cash transfers and nutrition behavior change communication activities. And in these households, the impacts are large, sustained, and remarkable. The households that were in the cash plus BCC treatment arm in the north obtained sustained impacts on household consumption. Impacts that were observed not only when the intervention took place, but 4 and 8 years after the intervention ended. To give you a sense of the magnitude of these effects, 3/4 of the households in the cash plus BCC treatment arm who were considered to be extremely poor at baseline had escaped poverty by 2022. And very few of the households which initially escaped poverty fell back into it after the intervention ended. But because of the timing of these follow-up surveys, we could also assess how the TMRI intervention arms helped households cope during the COVID-19 pandemic. We found that the cash plus BCC treatment arm of the TMRI allowed households to cope with the COVID-19 shock much better than other households, to maintain higher levels of food security, and were less in need of undertaking coping or other adverse strategies. Households in the cash plus the BCC treatment arm, both during and in the aftermath of the intervention, built up assets in particular that could generate new sources of income. These higher level of assets and this additional income generation were key in their ability to address the COVID-19 related economic shocks that Bangladesh experienced. Whether this transfers to other types of shocks, such as climatic shocks, is something we can't directly address with the data we have. Having said that, it does give us some clues. We know from work done in other studies that an important feature of households' ability to address or withstand climate-related shocks are their ability to build up resource bases, savings, assets, and the like. And certainly the cash plus BCC arm and TMRI seem to have done that. One of the things that you will have heard several times over as I've been discussing this work is these large effects of the treatment arm where cash transfers were combined with nutrition behavior change communication activities. These activities focused largely on training and discussions between the trained community nutrition worker and young mothers. The training comprised discussing the components of good diets, water and sanitation, and the like. You might say to yourself, well, that all sounds very valuable, but how is it that it can generate sustained increases in household consumption, reductions in poverty? The two things just don't seem to mash up in a terribly sensible way. But I think that misses several other features of this type of intervention and this type of complementary activity. The first is that the way this training was done was in the context of small groups. Women got together on a weekly basis with 10 to 12 other women to discuss all these ideas. One of the features of discussing ideas with other people is you begin to develop new skills in terms of problem solving. You also might begin to change your worldview a little bit, to actually see yourself as possibly having more agency over your life than you might first realized. From that, you then begin to say to yourself, well, I'm beginning to understand why a good diet is important. I'm beginning to understand better some of the food sources I could use to acquire that, what are some of the things I could do to actually facilitate that, particularly as knowing that this program is going to come to an end? So in our data, both quantitative and qualitative, we see those dynamics beginning to unfold with our study participants. They start undertaking investments, and in particular, in the north, which has the agroclimatic conditions to support this, starting investing in things like poultry and livestock. This does two things. It generates new sources of food for the household, and we see that in terms of improved diets that these households have. It's sources they get access even when lockdowns occur, which are one of the explanations as to why these households cope so well during COVID-19. And they create income generating assets, and that income generation can be used for all sorts of things. And we think that twinned with the fact were getting cash, that in the north they lived in a place where some of these new income generating activities were feasible, all bundled together are the explanation as to why we observe these long-term sustainable effects. So as we look at what we've done so far with the TMRI work, we feel we've begun to address some important evidence gaps, but others remain. And here I want to highlight two. The first is that in much of the work that I've described in this video, we focused on the impacts at the level of the household. Are households who participate in TMRI, are they better off from doing so, and are they better off in a sustainable fashion? But households consist of individuals, and there's no guarantee that even though the household may have benefited, there's no guarantee that all individuals within that household may have benefited. And this is an issue which is particularly salient in the South Asian context, where there have long been concerns about discrimination against women and girls in terms of access to household resources. We have the data from some of these follow-up surveys, importantly, including this follow-up survey that DEEP has funded, which will allow us to address this question directly. Second, as our TMRI households get older, so too do the children, the young people who were very, very young at the time of the initial intervention. These young children are now adolescents. They are beginning to shape their worldviews. They are, we hope, staying in school. We're hoping they've remained better nourished. In other words, one of the things we would also like to explore moving forward are the intergenerational impacts of the TMRI intervention. Is it possible that, in fact, interventions like this produce sustainable reductions in poverty, not only for this generation, but for the next one? And that would be truly incredible if that proved to be the case. That's where we hope to go for next.